Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, depends on when you happen to be catching us. Monday, October 6th marks the beginning of the Challenge Poverty Week for 2025. It's a national campaign coordinated by the Poverty Alliance. It was first launched in 2013. This week is all about shining a light on poverty and inequality and highlighting the urgent need for meaningful long-term solutions to build a fairer Scotland for everyone. And I am privileged to be joined by Tommy Campbell from the Aberdeen TUC. The last time I checked, I was Steph, and I'm pretty sure for the remainder of this broadcast, I actually will be. Thank you, Tommy.
Pleasure to be here.
So, can you tell me a little bit about the roles and aims of the Aberdeen Trade Union Council?
Aberdeen TUC has been in existence for over 150 years now. It's the local eyes and ears of the Scottish TUC. It's made up of the affiliated trade union branches from most of the unions that exist. In fact, all the unions that exist in Scotland have got branches affiliated to the ATUC. Delegates are then nominated by those branches, so we've got a good mixture of people attending our monthly meetings, and we have an executive committee as well. And that's people from all aspects of working life, both the public sector and the private sector.
So it's really a blend of the community with regards to essentially work.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's a very important point, Steph, that trade unions, particularly at local level, were active in the workplace on the day-to-day basis. Union shop stewards and full-time officers will be negotiating wages, representing members on disciplinary or grievances, maybe fighting on equal pay fronts, looking after health and safety issues. But workers come to work, but they also live in communities. And through the local ATUC, we have got all these connections with outside organisations, progressive organisations, charities, or links with the churches, the synagogue and the mosques. We're a broad church, excused upon, a very broad church, in fact, of different people. And that's what's important about it. It's about that human contact. And it's about the physical, mental, and, of course, the material well-being of the people that we represent.
And as we said off mic, and something I genuinely want to highlight here, is the fact that when we're looking at things like poverty, it doesn't just reflect on how much money you have at the end of the month and whether you have more month than you do money. It's broader than that. And as you said about community and community connection being so significant, so important. I think when we start looking at the potential of isolation, that doesn't help from a poverty standpoint, because you get caught in your own sort of cycle. And having a community, organizations like the TUC to sort of help pull people out.
Yeah, that's a very, very important point, Steph. That we sometimes, people go to work or they're involved in terms of earning money to obtain some of the material things in life. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, we need some of the material things. But we should never lose sight of the fact that our humanity and our mental well-being is about the interconnections with each other. I mean, I love that expression in Scotland that we're all Jock Thompson's bairns.
Yes, I have to admit, I love that too.
I think it's great. You know, I've been living here myself for 40 years. I'm an Irish immigrant. I came here for work. And I love the place, and as a result of living here the last 40 years, I've met all of Jock Thompson's bairns, people who have come to live here from all over the world. And I think that's what's making Aberdeen a rich place, rich in that kind of mental well-being. I think from the Aberdeen TUC's point of view, there are interconnections with those progressive and community-based organisations. One example I'm aware of, one of our affiliated branches within Unite represents the City Council workers, and they organise a fun day not far from here, from Shmu, down at the Woodside playing fields. And that's free. We put on all sorts of activities, particularly aimed at children as well as adults. And it's a fun day with weather permitting. It's held outside. And it's nice to see a smile going on people's faces as they're interconnecting with each other. And that's something, I think it was Anne Frank that once said that we should always be giving something. even if it's just a little bit of kindness. And we need to get back to that part of our humanity, which is about looking after each other, about caring for each other and our kindness. But we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the poverty in our society is created by the inequality of the distribution of wealth. The problem isn't one of poverty, the problem is one of wealth. UK and Scotland were part of one of the 6th richest nations in the world. And we're seeing children going to school starving, seeing pensioners starving, seeing workers going to work starving, trying to eke out a living in this cost of living crisis. And that needs to be addressed. And the people we expect to help address that is trade unions negotiating through collective bargaining to improve the wages of workers. But there's also the political aspect as well, that we expect our political representatives, irrespective of which political party people have voted for or whether it's an independent politician, we should expect them to look after the public purse, to look after it in their interests, because after all, it's our money that's in that public purse.
Oh, no, I absolutely agree with that. And you touched on something that I think is extremely important, and that is the gap. I hate to call it the wealth gap, but that's essentially what it is. Mm-hmm. And how I was looking at a figure recently, the richest in the 1%, and that's not just here, that's worldwide, control more than 60% of all the wealth. Mm-hmm. So you've got 99% who have 40% of the wealth in the world. There's something wrong with that equation. The maths just don't math.
Yes.
When it comes to that, and it leads to other issues as well. Yeah. You feel like I can understand you feeling like no matter what you do, you're not doing enough. And so then again, this feeds into that cycle I was sort of talking about before.
We definitely need to be fighting back on the issues. We've seen a very successful campaign last year when the UK government announced that they were going to end the fuel allowance. And that, of course, contributed considerably to more poverty. It meant a lot of pensioners were then going to have to choose between eating and heating. And a massive campaign was launched, both by the trade unions and also by all the community-based organisations and those organisations that represent pensioners. And that was successful. There's an old saying, it's the squeaky wheel that gets the oil. And certainly the government got the message, and that's why it's been reinstated. Obviously, it's not been reinstated in full because they've put limits on it. And of course, they're taxing people who have got other incomes as well. But essentially, you're right, it's about the redistribution of wealth. About 40 years ago in Scotland, there was a radical theatre group called 784. And it got its name from, at that time, the general consensus was that 7% of the population owned 84% of the wealth. That figure has now drastically changed. I think it's safe to say that it's a couple of percent now own over 90% of the wealth, both here in Scotland and in the UK. So what's been happening essentially is that governments have been a party to this. They have been robbing poor Peter to fund super rich Paul. That's what it's come down to at the end of the day. And the rich have got richer. We've seen it during the COVID crisis as well. Very rich people dipping their hands into the public purse. Michelle Mone, for example, getting £300 million.
That's a great example, actually.
Greedy. She's not the only one. Their greed is beyond belief. And that's where the problem is. We need to recognise, because there's one big lie, and that is that there is no money, and that is just a big lie. We have a society where very quickly government can find the money to go to war and fund other wars in other parts of the world. What we need to get away from is reconstruct the mind to get away from warfare and get back to welfare. Because this planet, if we want to save, it's going to be saved by people.
I agree. And there was something else that I've been seeing, especially coming from certain parts of the community, without pointing any fingers, because that's the last thing I want to do. That just actually adds things that don't necessarily need to be there and actually hamper a discussion. And that is understanding and empathy. Mm-hmm. And there doesn't seem to be enough of that. It's not that it doesn't still exist, because it does. It's just the ones who should be showing a little bit more are the ones who need the least.
Yes.
You look at the ones that have less, they're actually more likely to be willing to do more to help. Mm-hmm. Because if I help you up, you're going to help me up. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of the philosophy that mm-hmm. goes behind it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that we really need to...
My upbringing was essentially that both my parents and my grandparents had a very simple message to me as a child, that whatever you do, do something good. You know, don't always help, because someday that'll come round to help you if you need it. And certainly don't be doing any harm, because if it does, it'll come back to haunt you. So it was always about giving and helping and sharing. And that's what my makeup is, and always has been and will be to the day of my last breath. And we need to get back to that. We had an element of that during the COVID crisis. People realised that we had neighbours, that neighbours needed to be looked after. People needed to get the shopping done. I played my part in that as well in my own neighbourhood. And equally so, people realised the significant contribution people in the health service made, and other workers as well, transport workers, bus drivers, taxi drivers, all playing their part, keeping people moving around, particularly essential workers and emergency workers. So people pulled together during the COVID crisis. People pulled together during the Second World War, for example. So people have got that capability when the crisis comes. But we now need to pull together, I think, and I know I'm not into putting portions of blame, but we need to get governments to realise and put the pressure on them that they need to have a new taxation system that introduces a wealth tax on the super rich. My own union has showed figures that a 1% super wealth tax would be able to restore all the cuts in public services. So in my mind, I would rather go for the happy hour and double that up, because not only would we be able to restore the cuts, but we'd be able to build more libraries, build more swimming pools, build more schools, build more hospitals in rural communities as well, improve our ambulance services, and start looking at what is good for people and not for the very rich at the very top. What do they need all that money for anyway? You know, this mindset that they have, that they want to be greedier and greedier. You know, there's enough in the world for everybody's need. So it's just about redistributing that. And that's where the politician's role comes in. They should have that taxation system introduced that makes sure that the super rich pay their way, just the same as we all do.
One of the things about challenge poverty is work and the working poor, which is a term that I dislike immensely. But sadly, it's accurate. One of the things that we're talking about is better jobs. How would the TUC and how would you define what constitutes a better job? Considering we have things like minimum wage and so on and so forth, what would be something that would qualify as a better job?
Well, one example I would give, we have a crisis in the care service. And the crisis is on two fronts. One, I'm not being able to recruit staff. I don't believe for 1 minute that there's not enough people, men and women in our society, that don't want to have a career in the care and service. But if they're drawn by labour costs somewhere else where they can get higher wages, whatever that's working in a factory or working, stacking the shelves in Lidl, instead of working in our care service or an NHS service, it's because of the wages. Terms and conditions are important, but wages is what people go to work for. It's to earn a living, to pay their bills, pay their rent, pay their mortgage, have a standard of living. So a better job then sometimes has to be based around what the terms and conditions and the wages actually are. And that will draw people into a particular sector. For example, construction workers that go offshore to work in the oil and gas industry, it's not because they're like, some may well prefer the routine of the shift system of the 3 on and 3 off, or 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. The money is a lot greater that you can earn in the oil and gas industry offshore than you would in the construction industry onshore. So it's always, as the saying goes, you should always be looking maybe to sell your labour to the higher and the better bidder. And in that way, then, if we move towards better jobs, but the reality is, as we move away in a just transition, for example, in the oil and gas industry with the climate emergency and that, we have to recognise that people have become accustomed to earning certain levels of income. And accordingly, they have maybe bought cars, have bought houses, and they have a standard of living associated with that. So basically, there's no reason why that can't be continued in a just transition, because the companies that are making the millions of pounds, in case billions of pounds profits, back to that taxation system should pay for that transition. But there's an equally more important transition over and above the just transition connected to the climate change, and that is a transition from poverty to better improved terms and conditions and a transition to a more wealth-based economy. If we put money back into the pockets of workers, put more benefits into the pockets of those who are temporarily out of work or those who are, for example, on disability benefits, and put more money back into the pockets of pensioners as well, they'll spend that. That'll go back into the economy in a cycle. They'll start going back out again. They'll start going eating out in restaurants. They'll start going back to the bars for some entertainment and for socialisation. They will also start to have holidays. They will spend more money in the shops. That then will generate and make the economy healthier. But also, getting back, Steph, to the conversation we had earlier, it's not just then about that material wealth of having that security of employment or security of a reasonably good income. It's then about the poverty of the mind. It's about mental ill health that's associated with poverty. We can improve people's well-being by improving the terms and conditions that they're working in, and also improving those who are in benefits and those who are pensioners on their pensions as well. I think it will make people feel better. That contributes then to their mental well-being, and that takes less pressure off our health service. We see it day in, day out. We all will know somebody who is suffering. Just recently, the ATUC led wreaths at a memorial tree in Hazelhead Park on the 10th of September, World Suicide Prevention Day. Everybody that turned up at that I was speaking to admitted to me privately that they knew somebody within their extended family network and then within their community who had sadly taken their own lives. And we must recognise that sometimes contributions to people feeling not well mentally is linked to their insecurity and to the economic circumstances of society. There may well be other contributing factors, but we need to get back again on that front as well, back to that the poverty of the mind, getting back to the wealth of the mind, that getting back, as you just said, to the empathy and our human contact with each other. Back to the point of kindness, even just saying hello to somebody nowadays. You notice sometimes people just walk on by people now. And we need to get back to, even if it's just a smile. We have a saying in Ireland, you should always smile because it adds value to your face. And we need to get back to that.
And see, I always took it from the point of view, you should always smile because people never know what you're up to.
Right, okay. Yeah, there's an element of that too, I suppose. A mischievous smile doesn't
My
go
dad
to
was Glaswegian. That just...
Yes.
That just said so much. But I agree that there's a through line in all of this. And it also has to do with, because you said poverty of the mind and wealth of the mind. And one of the things that I think actually factors into that is overall satisfaction. Mm-hmm. Let's face it, if you're working someplace where you feel you're not always going to have a bounce in your step walking into work, but you feel comfortable where you work and so on and so forth, you're going to feel better about that job. And when the day is over and you've gone home, and it doesn't matter what shift you're working, it really doesn't. If you're going home with that sense of satisfaction, your life is actually instantly better. It's not a hard equation. It's not something difficult to figure out. So you can see this through thread. And one of the things that comes to mind for me, and it sort of builds on something you've also said, I was reading how certain places have made massive increases in things like the minimum wage, where in essence there isn't such, it's not seen as low-paid work. It's seen as fair value for what you do. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that happened, and you've actually alluded to it, is the fact that people are putting money back in that economy. And we're talking about a reasonable sized city. The city I actually have in mind is the city of Seattle. What they did a few years ago is they set a minimum wage at $15 US. So it didn't matter whether you were flipping burgers at McDonald's or you were doing something else. You were guaranteed a minimum wage of $15 an hour. What they found was within a year or 2 years, a good chunk of that extra income was being put back into the economy. They weren't really saving a lot because, quite frankly, a lot of people don't. But what they were doing is they were essentially propping up other aspects of the same local economy, and everybody was benefiting. So I look at how, without certain companies being pointed out, there are these low-paid jobs, and then you have things like zero-hour contracts. Essentially, I always look at a zero-hour contract as being perennially on call, because you're essentially waiting for the company to give you a jingle and say, right, this afternoon, you're in 2 till 10. How can you live that way? Yeah. And what would that do to essentially your life?
Messes your life up. People, particularly in the hospitality industry, who suffer working under the zero-hour contracts, people that I know that work in that industry, they're all over the place. I mean, you rightly point out, they're at the beck and call of the boss. That's totally outrageous. And that's why, with it being made unlawful, of course, is a good step in society. And I would put a warning out to workers out there that be careful when it comes to voting, and look at those political parties that oppose the zero-hour contracts and wish to abolish zero-hour contracts, and look to make sure that the political parties that have maybe voted for zero-hour contracts is not one that you should be lending your vote to. So be very careful and get back to voting and get back to analysing what political parties are saying, but what they're actually doing as well. And that will make our society healthy as well, because we need to make all politicians accountable, not just for what they're saying, but for what they're doing as well, irrespective of which political party it is. The issue of getting back to spending the money, you're right, most workers will save a little, maybe, if they have a wee bit to save, but they're saving it for the old saying, for a rainy day, which means their intention is to spend it again. So as long as the money is circulating around the economy, then that's better. One example how things have declined in Aberdeen, when I'm retired 6 years from a full-time union job, and I was representing a lot of the taxi drivers, and there was approximately around about 1,200 to 1,300 registered taxi drivers in Aberdeen, we'll just say about 10 years ago. My understanding, that's down to about 600 now. That's a reflection on the number of people who aren't going out anymore, in my opinion. To drop, 800, 700 odd, taxi drivers no longer working in the field shows you how much trade has dropped and cut back. You see it with the shopping. The late night shopping now is fairly non-existent in Aberdeen. That would have been quite a good trade for taxi drivers. That's just one example. The bars and the restaurants are all suffering too. So they're the ones that are paying staff the minimum wage, they themselves. So there is an effort has to be made both by the small businesses and through the unions and the workers as well, combining to force this issue to get wages up. The minimum wage should be what it is, the minimum wage. But when businesses become healthy and are making increasing profits and all the rest of it, they should be sharing some of that back to the workforce. Equally so, the workforce then will share that back into the local economy as well. The problem we have, in my opinion, in Aberdeen now, for example, in public services, the City Council has a debt of about 1.5 billion of all the loans they've borrowed over the years. And the repayments for that, somewhere in the region between 50 to 55 million pounds a year.
So essentially,
on interest alone.
So essentially, just about everything they're doing is literally servicing the debt.
Servicing the debt. And that's why they're cutting back on swimming pools, cutting back on community centres and all those community facilities. And that's linked again to the mental well-being. A lot of people found refuge by being able to go along to the local library or along to the local community centre. They would have known people there. You close that library, you close off maybe that point of contact that people had. So there's a knock-on effect, they're not just saving money as they think it in order to pay the financiers, to pay the treasury and that. They're destroying people's lives.
It's most of us are people of simple pleasures. Let's face it, that's what it is. It doesn't require a lot to sort of make us, I won't say outright happy, but somewhat more content, because we all need that sort of relief valve. And every time one of those gets closed off, or not eliminated entirely, but it's made much more difficult to have access to it, it does impact our well-being. Just simply getting around, getting out for a walk, but you want to walk someplace different. You've got the buses. Right, it's Sunday. You only have 2 buses now instead of the 3 or 4. I've got less opportunity to go do this or that. It's a knock-on effect. One sort of impacts another, and that's the kind of thing that sort of continues. And I start thinking about this because when you look at the fact that I think it's about 14% are working of households are working but living in poverty. That's a rather disturbing number. And those are people that are quite often have more than one job and are struggling to get by. I was reading, and this comes from a couple of different economists that I've read over the last, I'd say 6 or 8 months. And one of the things that I found is you look at a country that has an extremely low unemployment rate, yet still has considerable inflation and so on and so forth. You'll find that the reason that employment rate is so low is because the people are working more than one job.
Yeah.
Back in the day, I used to work 3 jobs. And it was genuinely a means to an end. Honestly, 2 jobs were able to allow me to do the 3rd job, knowing full well that none of them on their own was enough for me. But you can only do that for so long before you reach burnout, before you reach a state where maybe you are heading into some kind of depression. So it all impacts your mental well-being. And that seems to be a big thread for what we're doing with this particular program.
Not uncommon. My own mum, for example, when I was growing up, had 4 jobs, 4 part-time jobs, 3 cleaning jobs and 1 working in a hotel and a catering role. When I was doing the Equal Pay campaign here over 20 years ago in local government, you get to know the part-time women workers, and the majority of them all had a couple of jobs at the council. Some had 3, some had 4. There was one woman had 5 part-time jobs at the council. And I only found that out because she was offered the money in one of the jobs, and then she happened to say at the meeting, "What about my other jobs?" And I says, "What other jobs?" And because a lot of cleaners have got jobs in the private sector, maybe cleaning a small office or something like that. And then when I sat down and realised she was being swicked on these other jobs, but most of the women workers, it was mostly women part-time workers, all the ones that I got to know all had, just like my mum, 3 and 4 little part-time jobs, trying to eke out an existence. The working poor, that's what they were, and they were kind people. They were hard working, and that's, we need to get back to that. You're talking about the libraries, for example. I remember my granny saying to me, "You know the reason why I read a book," she says, "I can sit in a chair and read a book, and I can travel the world and meet lots of people and not have to get out of the chair."
I actually quite like that approach.
And that's, that taught me even as a child, the importance of reading books. But she also said, not only just read a book, but she says you need to talk with people all the time. And she says, us Irish, we're a nation of talkers, she says. But just remember that in the conversation, there will be a gold nugget of education, she says. You will learn something. Most conversation will just be incidental, she says, how you doing, how's things, which is important as well. But somewhere along the lines in conversations, you will learn something from somebody else, and that's important to do that, to talk and to listen. So there again was these foundation stones about our humanity, about the wealth of the mind as opposed to the poverty of the mind. But as I say, they say money is the root of all evil. But, in some respects, money can rent a bit of happiness from time to time if it's a regular income and you're being treated. The other good point to raise, Steph, when I worked in the building sites, we had an old-fashioned foreman. He said, "A happy crew is a working crew." And we would have gone to the end of the earth for this guy because he treated us with great respect, and equally so we treat him with respect as well. But when I was a union officer, I dealt with companies where there was some very good managers. And I can tell you, absenteeism in these companies was very low. There was a good atmosphere. People got on with each other. But equally so, I dealt with some rogues inside large public sector institutions as well, where a lot of bullying went on and a lot of unhappiness. Absenteeism very high in certain sectors. And I left school at 16. It's not rocket science to work out that there was a lot of people off with a lot of stress at work. It's not because of the work itself, because most people like the job they do, whether that's a caring job, whether it's digging holes, whether it's driving a bus or whatever. If there's some other underlying reason for that illness, then normally what you find is being caused by the actions of another individual or individuals. And that's another sad part of our society that I've seen an increase, particularly in the last 20 years, was the increase of bullying and harassment at work.
Yeah, and actually, honestly, I would genuinely say, and you alluded to it earlier, since COVID, because of the amount of time we spent in our own bubbles, and you have your keyboard warriors and so on, that
Terrible.
That this is a problem, and I think it's genuinely going to continue unless we collectively put our foot down and say we're not going to take that anymore. We're not going to tolerate it, because the thing is, we've already got enough other things to deal with. Why would we want to foist something additional on ourselves? Like, I'll be honest with you, I spend as little time on standard social media as possible, and I do it for a reason. It's good for my well-being.
Yes.
And honestly, it's common sense.
Yes.
The whole expression "touch grass" actually means something. And
I think you're right that it's important. There's a lot of nonsense, keyboard warriors. People, unfortunately, sometimes can get their ideas from the last person they've spoken with or the last thing that they have read. And they can't make the distinction between what is nonsense, effectively, not common sense at all, but nonsense. There was a German philosopher, Hannah Arendt, who talked about the purpose of lying. That lying wasn't just designed to tell people lies, just so that it was designed so that they couldn't maybe distinguish between eventually what is falsehood and what is truth. But then she says it goes much deeper in that. Once you then tell that lie and get people confused about what is true and what is false, it also then goes deeper, that they cannot then make up their mind about what is right and what is wrong. And we need to get back to that. There's a general common sense on what we reasonably believe to be what is right and what is wrong. And there's one thing for certain: it is very wrong to have children going to school starving, to have children starving, to have pensioners starving, and the working poor hungry and cold in the winter time. That is so wrong, especially when we've got so much wealth that could be distributed back down the line again. Stop this robbing poor Peter to pay rich Paul.
It's a constant theme, and if you've gone back and you've looked at economic history in a number of different countries, and I've had, depending on how you look at it, the good fortune or misfortune to see the differences and the swings. Essentially, there's three that sort of stand out. I grew up in the boom and bust in the late 70s through the early 90s in Canada, in oil, gas, and coal. And so I saw this sort of thing firsthand. And I was, my dad was a union member. I've been a union member myself for different things. When I worked in media, I had to be a union member for certain jobs. But it meant that I had to walk a tightrope. And the tightrope that I had to walk it depended on what job I was doing. Quite frankly, I was the ultimate dog's body, because if there was a job there, I was doing it at one point or another, whether it was technical or whether it was as a presenter. So the hours I was working as a presenter, I was not union. The hours that I was working doing the technical side of things, I was very much within the union. And it was awkward for me. So it sort of leads me to a question in particular that's kind of in two parts. And this is because of what we're looking at, and we've talked about what constitutes a better job and so on and so forth. How can we both empower people in the workplace, and because unions are not everywhere, they don't have the same they don't have the same coverage as they once did. And that's for a lot of different reasons, which would be a whole topic on its own. What kind of roles can and do trade unions have?
Well, very important role in the workplace, and that's representing workers, both at an individual and at a collective level. The reason why when Margaret Thatcher got elected in 1979, we look back now, in hindsight is an exact science. She was very determined to destroy as much as she possibly could collective bargaining. Because when we look back, you talked about, Steph, about bust and boom. Way back in the 70s, the working people were better off, relatively speaking. Their wages was better. A huge number of workers were covered by collective bargaining agreements right across the industries, working in both the public and the private sector. Thatcher came into power and she was determined to destroy that. And why was she wanting to destroy it? It was very simple. She was wanting to rob poor Peter to give to rich Paul. The first thing she did within hours of getting elected, she abolished exchange controls. The amount of money that rushed out of the UK to investments, and particularly in South Africa at the time. So this idea, if the unions are strong and all the rest of it, she knew what she was doing. She was there to elect it to look after the interests of the super rich at that particular time. There was other Tories in her cabinet who understood the economics of society. That's when you then had the fallout in the 80s. There was the Westland helicopter scandal. There was, even on the agricultural side, the egg scandal with Edwina Currie. These were battles that were going on inside the cabinet about what do. You use money to make the economy better by investing in industries. But Thatcher was grabbed by the finance capitalists who want to make money out of money, which doesn't produce anything at all. And that's when those battles then surfaced in the Tories. You had the Tories who were in the interests of the insurance companies, the banks and the financiers, and they won the day. And that's why we ended up with a deindustrialised society. The coal mines were closed down, and then we had the crazy situation of then importing coal at paying a lot more for it. That's what's happening now with the closure of Grangemouth and the so-called just transition. There could have been a development at Grangemouth to make, sustainable aviation fuel. That's not going to happen. And the reason for that not being allowed to happen is that Grangemouth is half owned. Petronius is half owned by the Bank of China. Mm-hmm. The reality is they're going to develop that fuel themselves. So we're going to end up importing that fuel eventually and paying through our nose for it. All about the money.
I always joke about living in 3 time zones. And there's a good reason for it. I've still got family in Canada. I'm here, and I've still got friends and close acquaintances that live in China and Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually literally right in the middle of the two. And so when I listen to you talk about that, I know what it sounds like from the Canadian perspective. I know what it sounds like from the Chinese perspective, and I see the backhanding that goes on here. And personally, I find it really frustrating. Because when you talked about Thatcher, one of the first things that came to mind for me, I was in Canada, we had Mulroney, a conservative. Mm-hmm. We had in the United States, Uncle Ronnie, Ronald Reagan. Mm-hmm. And I look at the 3 of them and the number of significant difficulties that came because of them. And actually, Reagan was done in 88 into 89. Thatcher was 1990. Mulroney held out till 91, 92. They had spent their time. And one of the things that happened under a conservative government in Canada was austerity, and significant austerity, through which they took the old manufacturer's tax, which was built into the price of anything that you bought, turned it into the GST, which was the goods and services tax. They were going to bring that in at 12%. They ended up bringing it in at 7%, because they were actually following the New Zealand model. And for those of you that don't know, the New Zealand model came in the late 1980s at 12%, essentially to solve economic shortfalls. But the truth of the matter is, they had already been cutting taxes because they were conservatives. And it meant that they had actually essentially created their own shortfalls. So this is what we're talking about here. When you drop a brick on your own foot, it's going to hurt. And this is essentially what happens across the board. There is easier and better ways that don't have to be so invasive, and they don't have to hit the people that are in most need. That's never what gets done. They frame it that it's not going to hurt lower down, but it's because it's all done in the form of sound bites and so on and so forth. Because this is what it is. There is nothing that goes on these days that's not a slogan-based something or other. And people are susceptible to it. Make it rhyme, do it in time.
Yes, yeah. Well, it's like what Hannah Arendt said, when you get to a situation where you've been fed so much stuff that you can't make up your mind about what's true and what's false, then you can't decide what's right and what's wrong. Well, I think it's very right that workers should organise themselves into trade unions. If we look at our history, the reason why things improved for people in their working lives down the last 150 years is that at one time children were working down the mines and that. Well, that got stopped. Pregnant women, for example, had to work right up to giving birth. Then there was no holidays, no sick pay. All these things all came about. It didn't come because the bosses decided to be kind and give it back to the workers. It was fought for through strikes and through collective action. And it's still, to this day, it's important, the role of trade unions, both industrially and politically as well. People think, for example, that the trade unions, we all have political funds, that fund is for the Labour Party. It's a very small percentage of it goes to the Labour Party. Most of it funds the political campaigns. For example, the campaign to try and save Grangemouth, run by my own union, was paid for out of the political fund. The No Ban Without a Plan campaign, the Winter Fuel Allowance campaign, was all paid for out of that political fund, and we were opposing the UK Labour government on the issue, because as far as we're concerned, we want to get back to what it says on the tin. If it says that you're Labour, then you should be looking after the Labour of our country, which is the working man and working woman.
Absolutely. Actually, and that leads into something that I want to ask, and that is what sort of specific support can the Aberdeen Trades Union Council and the affiliated unions offer individuals?
Well, because of our connections with our various other progressive organisations, one of our campaign groups here at Aberdeen is Just Scunnered. We've got links, we keep our links with the groups out in the communities. Even on the non-political side, for example, a lot of union branches give. We've recently, for example, give food a donation to a food bank. So we will engage in charitable work in the sense of giving some of our funds over to those in most in need. Small amounts it may well be, but it's the empathy again and building those links. We have to always recognise that trade unions are made up of people, union members. A trade union is not something like an organisation on the outside. It's made up of men and women basically working together, irrespective of their political background and that, for the greater good, both in the workplace and in the wider community. And we will never hesitate in our history over the last 150 years in this city, not just at local level, but at national and international level as well. We won't shy away from showing our empathy with people all around the world. That's why every year we have our May Day March, and then in our St. Andrew's Day March in November, we're against racism, we're against fascism, we're against war. We're for peace and prosperity for everyone. We want the world to be a better world. And we're capable of doing that as humans. This idea, Robbie Burns did say that man's inhumanity to man would make countless thousands more, and we're seeing wars all over the world at the moment. We're seeing what's happening with the genocide in Gaza, with the war in Ukraine, war in Yemen. There's wars in the African continent as well. All being funded, by the way, through the richest nations of the world. And we need to get back to people understanding. We can end up saying a big no to that. Don't shy away from saying to your politicians, I don't agree with this. I would rather that money spent on people rather than on the profit for the multinational companies.
That actually lines up. I swear you're teeing them up for me. This is actually great. So the Scottish Government has a vision of fair work nation for or by 2025, which they describe as secure employment with fair pay and conditions where workers are heard and represented. Where are we with this? Are we where we need to be, or do we still have a ways to go?
Well, we've got leaps and bounds to go. We've got so many millions of people living in abject poverty right across the UK. Many pensioners and working people in Scotland, people on benefits, living in abject poverty. So there's leaps and bounds to be made. Now, it's good that there is a policy of intent. The reality is, to make that happen, it has to be funded.
See, I look at it, I always say theory and practice.
Yes, absolutely.
And I agree with you. There's loads of fantastic theories, but unless you can put them into practice, and you are absolutely right in what you say about funding, because whether we want to admit it or not, there's always going to be that monetary element that needs to be there.
And they say there's no money. For one local example, there's a massive campaign here that ATUC fully supports over in Torre, Saving the St. Fittick's Park campaign. Right?
I know a little about that, yeah.
And, quite recently, I think this week, the Scottish Government's announcing giving, I think it's £4 to £5 million to do with just transition zones in this area, and they're giving money to various quangos and companies. Not even a penny. The benefit of that community of protecting and developing St. Fittick's Park for the benefit of the community, that money would be better spent giving it to the people in Torrey. They would put it to really good use.
Actually, I happen to live in the area, so I could see where it could be done.
So there's money being redirected to companies that have got tons of money anyway. You know, they should be made to spend their profits if they're genuinely interested in just transition, instead of using taxpayers' money. And taxpayers' money should be going towards projects that are really well and really worthwhile. And that's where we have the contradiction.
See, now there, again, that leads to another thing. When it comes right down to it, who should we be holding to account? Should we be holding employers to account, or should we be holding the government? Or is it kind of a combination of both?
Combination, Steph, of both. We live in a society that's democratic. There's minimum democratic standards. We pay our taxes. And everybody pays taxes, by the way. This idea that people on benefits don't pay tax, everybody pays VAT. People pay their national insurance and they pay their taxes, and that money goes into the public purse. But there's governments are allowing multinational companies not to pay their share at all. And we're talking about billions of pounds that should be in the public purse from that side of our society, which is the employers, and these are massive. We're not talking about small businesses here. We're talking about the massive multinational companies. And if they were made pay their way, then we would be stepping towards eradicating poverty in our society and being an example to other countries around the world. I have every confidence that you're right, the theory and the practice. They have the right policy, but maybe, in my dictionary, practice follows policy.
It should.
And it should, far as they're concerned, instead of all the fancy words. So they can say what their intention is, but they need to be seen to be activating it, and therefore they need to be held accountable. When they say there's no money, and then they give tons and tons of money to the very companies that are causing the problem in the first place, then that shows to me that there's a bit of hypocrisy, political hypocrisy going on, and we need to point the finger and scream from the rooftops, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. Because it's only when we lose things, for example, St. Fittick's Park, if that gets destroyed in part or in whole, then the people will soon realise, what are we doing here with our good areas of green space? Which, back to the conversation we had earlier about poverty and well-being. Weather permitting, of course, it is good for people to go into our green spaces.
And that's exactly why I talked about it, and that's actually why I mentioned touching grass, is because it doesn't sound like much, and it's sort of used as a cliche and a meme and so on and so forth these days. But the reality of it is you've got to get out. Get out of your bubble in whatever form that happens to take. And the more people I see doing that, the better I feel, because I know I only have control over me, so I'm making sure that I'm doing my bit. But when I see more people doing the same, it makes me feel a little bit better about potentially being on the right track. And we're kind of getting to the point where we're out of time, and we'll be very quickly. So I have one quick question. if you could send a message directly to those that make the decisions about better jobs, about being mentally poor or mentally wealthy, what would it be? What would that message be?
You're constantly being lobbied all the time by people representing the interests of the wealthy. Start getting back down onto the ground and empathising with the people on the ground that give you their vote, irrespective of which political party it is. Getting back to a unity in the community, and be wary of those people that are causing the divisions. And instead of spending time in warm offices and on fancy trips and fact-finding missions and being paid for by these multinational companies, get back down into the community centres in the area that you were elected to represent. I attended a meeting in Fraserburgh recently to do with disability cuts, and it was shocking. The women who organised the campaign were absolutely brilliant, because when the councillors were all sitting in a row, the first question they asked them is, do you know where the Robertson Road Daycare Centre is? And not one of them could tell them. And they were the councillors for the area, and it was going to suffer a cut. Therein, to me, lay the problem. Politicians have become so detached because they've allowed themselves to be detached. Back to the point, we, through the ATUC and through our community organisations, hopefully are going to start turning that round and getting people to be discontented with their lot, so they start grabbing the politicians and making the politicians accountable. And that's the message I would give the politicians. Wake up and smell the coffee. Stop looking after the interests of the super rich and start looking after the interests of the people who give you their vote.
So quite frankly, they need to be a pebble in the shoe.
Yes.
Tommy
well
Campbell, thank you so much. Tommy Campbell from the Aberdeen TUC. Challenge Poverty Week 2025. I am Steph, last time I checked, and we'll talk to you next time.